The explosion came from the left side of the valley, and it was so loud that Dr. Viren felt it in her teeth before she heard it. She was inside the medical rover, 2 kilometers back from the front line on Valdres IV. The screens around her showed real-time feeds from every soldier in the joint squad: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen, pain response. 14 signals in total, 8 alien, 6 human. All of them spiked at once when the Voakai drone cluster detonated in the narrow pass where the squad had been moving. Viren's 4 hands moved fast. She pulled up the individual readings, sorted by severity, and started organizing a triage order. 3 Dravari soldiers were showing elevated cardiac distress. 1 Velori was down, vital signs shallow but present. 2 humans were spiking adrenaline, which she had come to expect. Humans always spiked adrenaline. It was one of the first strange things she had noted about them when the joint deployment began 6 weeks ago. Then she looked at Signal 7. The name on the tag read, DCKER-RSGT. The number across his pain response monitor had gone completely red. That did not happen often. The suit sensors were calibrated to detect structural damage, bone fracture, organ displacement, tissue rupture. For the monitor to go full red, something catastrophic had to have occurred. She switched to his external camera. The feed showed smoke, dust, a section of tunnel wall that had collapsed inward, and under it, barely visible, a shape. A human shape buried under 2 tons of collapsed alloy support beam and rock. Viren opened a channel to Corpsman Ott, who was handling secondary triage beside her. Ott, Signal 7, Decker, check the structural scan. Ott looked up from his own screens. He was young for a Dravari, with wide amber eyes and a nervous habit of clicking his secondary fingers together when stressed. He clicked them now as he read the numbers. That is, he stopped, started again. That volume of material at that impact velocity against a body of his mass would produce. He did the calculation quietly, then sat back. Dr. Viren, that is not a survivable event for any species in the conquered registry. Viren said nothing. She was still watching the feed. She began composing the casualty report in her secondary screen. Standard protocol. Confirmed structural collapse, likely fatal impact. Recovery of remains to be scheduled upon end of active engagement. It was not a form she enjoyed filling out, but she had filled it out before. She kept her hands steady and her mind on the task. She was halfway through the form when Ott made a sound she had never heard from him before. It was not a word. It was not a question. It was something between a whistle and a gasp, the kind of noise a body makes when the mind has gone completely blank. Viren looked up. On screen 7, the rubble was moving. Not settling, not shifting under its own weight, moving, being pushed from underneath. She watched, and she would think about this moment for a very long time afterward as the collapsed support beam, which her structural sensor estimated at roughly 2,000 kilograms, rose at one end, slowly at first, then with more force. A hand appeared at the edge of the debris, then a shoulder. Then a human being pulled himself free of the pile, got one knee under him, placed a bloodied palm flat on the ground, and stood up. Sergeant Ray Decker stood up. He turned his head, looked around the smoke-filled pass. His helmet was cracked along the visor. His left arm was hanging at a wrong angle. There was blood on the side of his face, dark against his skin, and he was breathing in the short, sharp way her instruments told her meant pain, significant pain, but he was breathing. His squadmate, Sergeant Priya, came running from behind a broken wall. She grabbed his good arm. Decker looked at her and said something. Viren turned up the audio. The rest of the team clear. His first words, not a scream, not a call for medical help, a question about his squad. Priya answered. He nodded. He said something else, and even through the distortion of the damaged helmet audio, Viren caught it clearly. Good, that beam had bad aim. Ott had stopped clicking his fingers. He was perfectly still. His data slate had fallen off his knee and was lying on the floor of the rover, and he had not noticed. Viren minimized the casualty report without filing it. She pulled up the diagnostic feed instead and started running a real-time scan through Decker's suit sensors. 3 cracked ribs, 1 dislocated shoulder left, which explained the arm angle, internal bruising across the left side of the torso, hairline fracture along the lower orbital ridge of his skull, which meant the impact had reached his head. She sat with those numbers for a moment. A Thalori soldier with half that injury list would be unconscious, possibly in organ failure. The standard medical literature for 6 of the 7 species in the galactic Concord listed cranial fracture combined with internal bruising as a threshold event, the point past which the body could not maintain function without immediate intervention. Decker was asking Priya if the extraction shuttle had been called yet. Viren opened her recorder. She did not have a specific protocol for moments like this. There was no form, no checkbox, no pre-written category. She simply pressed record and spoke. Medical log, day 41, Valdris IV deployment. Human soldier Sergeant Decker sustained structural collapse impact. Preliminary scan confirms 3 fractured ribs, dislocated shoulder, internal bruising, hairline skull fracture. She paused. Outside, through the rover window, she could see the medevac lights in the distance, coming in fast. Soldier is ambulatory, self-directed, refusing to fall down. She paused again, watched the screen. Decker walked slowly but walked toward the extraction point. She finished the entry quietly. This should not be possible. Medical bay of the Steadfast Iron had been designed to handle any injury that any species in the galactic Concord might sustain. That was the claim in the ship's operational manual. Viren had read that manual 3 times over her career. She had believed it, right up until the moment Sergeant Ray Decker sat down on the examination bed and looked around the room like a man waiting for a slow clerk at a government desk. The medevac had docked 2 hours ago. Decker had walked off it himself. This had caused Ott, who was standing at the docking bay with a stretcher, to stare at the stretcher, stare at the human, and then slowly set the stretcher against the wall as if it had personally offended him. Commander Sale had been brief. The human was to remain in the medical bay until Dr. Viren cleared him. No arguments. Decker had said, "Yes, ma'am," without any particular argument, which Viren suspected had less to do with obedience and more to do with the fact that he was quietly exhausted and did not want to show it. She began the workup immediately. The equipment did not cooperate. The standard diagnostic cradle was calibrated for Thalori skeletal density, which was the ship's most common species. When she placed Decker's arm into it for a bone scan, the machine kept returning an error code that meant insufficient mass. She had to override it manually and recalibrate for a denser skeletal structure. The machine protested this 3 times with a blinking yellow light before it accepted the new values and produced a scan. She looked at the bone density reading. Then she looked at it again. Human bones were significantly denser than Thalori bones, not slightly, significantly. She made a note. She moved on to the clotting assessment. The suit sensors had shown active bleeding from a scalp laceration and found that the wound was already partially closed, on its own, in the 2 hours since the injury. Ott leaned over to look at the reading. "Is that normal for humans?" "I don't know," Viren said honestly. "I am finding out." She ran pain response next. The standard protocol was to apply calibrated pressure to the injury site and measure neurological feedback. It was not a pleasant test, and Viren warned Decker before she began. He said, "Go ahead." She applied the pressure to his cracked ribs. The neurological feedback monitor spiked sharply. He felt it, clearly and strongly, but his body's motor response stayed completely flat. No flinch. No withdrawal. He breathed out slowly through his nose and stayed still. Viren noted, pain response functional. Motor suppression in response to pain, extreme. Then Sergeant Priya arrived. Because apparently no one had told her she could not just walk into the medical bay. and she came through the door with a bag of food from the ship's human ration stores and dropped it on the bed next to Decker. "Got you the chicken one," she said. They were out of the beef. "The chicken one is fine," Decker said. Viren looked at the bag, then at Decker. "You want to eat right now." "Is that a problem?" he asked, not rudely, genuinely curious. "You have 3 fractured ribs and a skull fracture." He considered this the way someone might consider a mild weather forecast. "I know, I'm also hungry. Those 2 things can both be true." Priya sat down in the chair beside him and started eating her own ration. "He gets mean when he doesn't eat," she told Viren helpfully. "Well, meaner." Viren made another note. She was making a great many notes. The dislocated shoulder still needed to be addressed. She had been preparing the support brace and the reduction procedure, a careful, controlled process that she would normally administer with a low sedative to manage the pain. She turned to explain this to Decker. She turned back to find that while she had been at the supply cabinet, Ray Decker had reached across his own body with his good arm, gripped his left arm at the elbow, and pulled his shoulder back into place. By himself. Without sedative. Without warning her. The sound it made was not pleasant. Priya did not even look up from her food. "He always does that," she said. Viren stood very still. Ott, who had witnessed the whole thing from across the room, set down his tablet very carefully, excused himself very quietly, and walked out into the supply corridor. Viren could hear him through the door, breathing in the specific controlled pattern that indicated a Dravari attempting not to have a visible stress response in a professional environment. She walked to the supply corridor door and leaned against it. "Ott." "I am fine," he said, from somewhere behind a shelf of bandage rolls. "I know, come back when you are ready." She returned to the examination. Decker was rotating his newly reset shoulder with a slow experimental movement, checking the range of motion. He seemed satisfied. He picked up his food and started eating. Viren pulled up her comms panel and opened a channel to Dr. B1, the ship's xenobiologist, who was stationed in the research deck 2 levels up. She had worked with B1 for 4 years. He was brilliant, exhausting, and had a tendency to become so excited about new data that he forgot to sleep. She composed the message carefully. She described what she had seen: the bone density, the clotting speed, the pain suppression, the shoulder. She sent it. She waited. The response came in 40 seconds. "Viren, I am coming down immediately. Do not let it leave." She read the word it twice. She looked at Decker, who was eating his food and asking Priya whether she thought the war would be over before their next rotation. He looked like a man sitting on a bench in a park somewhere, waiting for nothing more alarming than a transit connection. Viren wrote one more line in her medical log. "The human continues to refuse to behave like something that has been seriously injured. I am beginning to think this is not stubbornness. I am beginning to think this is simply what humans do. Doctor." B1 arrived with a bag over one shoulder and an expression on his face that Viren recognized from the one time she had seen him discover an entirely new class of microorganism. It was the expression of a person who had already decided that whatever came next was going to be the most interesting thing that had ever happened to them, and who was going to enjoy every second of it regardless of whether the universe cooperated. He was Grevali, a tall species, pale gray, with long fingers and eyes set wide on a flat face. He was also, Viren had always thought, a little too comfortable in situations that made everyone else uncomfortable. He stepped into the medical bay, looked at Decker, looked at the scan results on Viren's screen, looked back at Decker and said simply, "Fascinating." Decker looked up from the last of his food. "You the scientist." "Xenobiologist," B1 said, already moving to the scan screen. "Though in this context I might better describe myself as a very confused admirer." He turned to Viren. "Walk me through everything, from the beginning." She did. She pulled up the full log, the impact data from Valdris IV, the initial scan readings, the bone density results, the clotting, the pain suppression, the shoulder. B1 listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He stood with his arms folded and his wide eyes moving from screen to screen, and the more she spoke, the more still he became, the way deep water goes still before something large moves through it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "May I ask the human some questions?" "Sure," Decker said. B1 turned to him with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting his whole career for exactly this conversation. "How long have humans been going to war with each other?" Decker tilted his head. "Recorded history, about 5,000–6,000 years, probably longer before that." "And how long has your species been dealing with large predators trying to eat you?" "On Earth," Decker said, "few million years, give or take." "Disease, famine, environmental collapse." "All of the above, several times." B1 turned back to Viren. He said nothing. He did not need to. She could see it in the way his expression shifted from excitement to something slower and more serious. "You see it," she said. "I see it," he confirmed. He sat down and opened his bag, pulling out a portable scanner of his own design, the kind he used for field research. "Dr. Viren, what you are looking at is not an anomaly. You are looking at the product of millions of years of a species being hunted, starved, diseased, frozen, burned, and nearly destroyed several times over and surviving all of it. The human body did not get this way by accident. It was shaped. Every generation that was a little tougher lived a little longer. Every bloodline that healed a little faster left a few more children. What you scan today is not Sergeant Decker specifically. It is every human who ever refused to die distilled." The room was very quiet. Priya, who had been listening from her chair, said, "Huh, no one's ever put it quite like that before." "Does it bother you?" B1 asked her. She thought about it. A little, but mostly it explains a lot of family reunions. B1 spent the next hour running his own scans. He was thorough in a way that Viren appreciated, methodical, precise, recording everything. Decker answered every question without complaint. He described his diet, his training regimen, his sleep patterns, the injuries he had sustained in the past, and how long they had taken to heal. B1's eyes got progressively wider. At one point, when Decker mentioned he had once broken 2 fingers on his right hand, set them himself using a piece of wire, and kept working for 6 days until a medic was available, B1 stopped typing and looked up at the ceiling for a long moment as if asking the universe for patience. 6 days, he said. Mission wasn't done, Decker said. Viren called Commander Sale. The briefing was held in Sale's private room, with only Viren and B1 present. Sale was Velori, tall, blue-gray, with a calm face that rarely showed much of anything. She listened to the full report without moving. When it was over, she looked at the scan results Viren had transferred to her display, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked one question. Are they aware of how dangerous they are? B1 looked at Viren. Viren thought about Decker asking if his food ration was the chicken one. She thought about Priya eating beside him like they were on a lunch break. She thought about the shoulder. No, she said. I do not think they think of themselves that way at all. Sale nodded slowly. Something moved behind her calm eyes. Not quite fear, not quite admiration. Something in between, something with no clean name in any language Viren knew. Good, Sale said. Let's keep it that way. She closed the briefing without another word. Viren walked back to the medical bay. Decker was doing slow shoulder rotations on the examination bed. He looked up when she came in. Can I have a second dinner? He asked. Ott, who had returned from the supply corridor and was attempting to finish his shift with professional dignity, made a small sound and pressed his palm flat against his own face. Viren sat down at her station. She opened her medical log. She typed carefully, in the clean clinical language she had used for 12 years of medical practice. Preliminary conclusion: human biological capacity exceeds all current conquered medical baselines. Recovery rate, pain tolerance, bone density, and systemic resilience are not individual traits but species-wide characteristics. Recommend full reclassification of human physiology in the conquered medical registry. She paused. She added one more line. Recommend also that anyone who has been calling humans the fragile species please review this file before speaking again. Ship went dark and quiet at the 18th hour, when the steadfast iron shifted into its night cycle, and most of the crew went to their quarters. The lights in the corridors dimmed to a low blue. The ventilation dropped to a softer hum. The medical bay, which was never fully dark, settled into a pale amber glow from the monitoring panels and the thin strip lights above each occupied bed. Viren stayed. She told herself it was because she wanted to track Decker's overnight healing rate in real time. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had too many thoughts moving inside her head and not enough room to put them anywhere. And sitting at her station with a screen full of data felt safer than lying in her bunk with nothing but the ceiling. She pulled up human history records on her secondary monitor. General files, the kind the conquered kept as public knowledge on member species. She had skimmed them before, weeks ago, when the deployment began. She had not read them carefully. Tonight, she read them carefully. She read about the ice periods, about the years the sun had been blocked by volcanic dust and entire populations had starved, about the plagues that had killed 1 in 3 humans in a single century, about the wars, the small ones and the large ones, and the ones so large they had names that still carried weight thousands of years later, about the times humans had split their own atom and nearly burned their world with it, about the centuries of slow damage to their atmosphere that had come close, very close, to making the planet uninhabitable. She read all of it, and the thing that kept stopping her, the thing she kept going back to, was not the disasters. It was the part that came after each one, the rebuilding, the slow, stubborn, grinding process of putting things back together. Humans had not learned to stop hurting each other before the next catastrophe arrived. They had simply kept surviving long enough to try again. She was still sitting with that thought when a voice came from across the room. "Can't sleep either." She looked up. Decker was awake, lying on his back on the examination bed, staring at the ceiling. He had not moved in 3 hours by the monitor record, and she had assumed he was asleep. "I was working," she said. "Sure," he said, without any edge in it. Just a quiet agreement to let her version stand. A few seconds passed. The ventilation hummed. One of the monitoring panels clicked softly through a routine check. "What are you reading?" he asked. She hesitated, then she answered honestly. "Human history, the general records." He was quiet for a moment. "The bad parts or the other parts?" "There seem to be a great many bad parts." "There are," he agreed. "There are some other parts too." She thought about asking him to name some. She did not. Instead, she asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the valley, the one she had not known how to word until now. "Were you afraid when the beam came down?" The room was very still. He did not answer immediately. She watched his vital signs on the monitor, heart rate steady, respiration even. He was not distressed. He was thinking. "Yeah," he said at last. "Yeah, I was scared. The kind of scared where you feel it in your stomach and your hands and you know it's bad before you even know what it is." She did not speak. She let him go on. "I remember thinking, this is it. This is the one I don't get up from." He paused. "And then my body just didn't listen to that thought. It started moving, got my arms up, pushed." He made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "My brain was saying we're done and my body said actually let's see about that." Viren processed this. She cross-referenced it with B1's theory, the millions of years of selection, the biological machinery that kept going past the point where reason said stop. It all lined up, and yet, the part I can't put in a medical report, she said slowly, is the part where you asked about your squad before you asked about yourself. He was quiet again. That's just what you do, he said. Why? Another pause. Because they matter more than the pain does, that's all. It's not complicated. She turned that over in her mind. She had studied biology, chemistry, neurology, xenomedicine. She could describe in precise terms why a human body kept functioning under catastrophic stress. She had no framework, no clinical language, no diagram in any textbook she had ever read for what he had just described. He fell asleep not long after. She watched his heart rate slow and stabilize, his breathing deepen, his body going to work in the dark in ways that still made her monitors hesitate before they found the right scale to display. She sat with it all for a while, the history on one screen, the vital signs on the other, a species that had been afraid over and over for millions of years and had chosen to keep going anyway, not because they stopped feeling fear, but because they felt it and stood up regardless. She opened her recorder, not a formal log entry, just a note to herself. I have been trying to understand the human since the valley. I have been asking what they are made of, what their cells do, why their bones are dense and their blood clots fast. Those are real questions, but I think I have been asking the wrong questions. She stopped recording. She looked at the monitor. Decker slept without any sign of trouble, his cracked ribs rising and falling with each breath. Outside the viewport, the stars were sharp and still, the way they always were out here, in the space between one world and another. Viren sat quietly and thought about courage, and what it meant to do the thing anyway. 3 days after the valley, Ott had just begun to convince himself that things were going to be normal again. He had developed a careful routine. Check on Decker from a distance. Log the readings. Do not make direct eye contact if the human was doing anything physical, because the human's idea of physical recovery was different from Ott's idea of physical recovery, and Ott had found that watching it gave him a feeling in his chest that he could not name, but that felt a great deal like the beginning of a spiritual crisis. He was in the middle of cataloging supply inventory, soothing, predictable, nothing alarming about bandage rolls when the ship shook. Not the small shake of turbulence, the long, deep shudder of a ship hit by something large. The lights flickered. The alert siren came on, the low-frequency pulse that the steadfast iron used for battle stations, and then the internal comm crackled and a voice said, "Volkai boarding group has breached Section 7. All non-combat personnel shelter in place. Security teams to Section 7. Section 7 was 2 corridors from the medical bay. Ott set down his inventory slate. He stood very still for a moment, running through his options in a methodical way that was mostly just his brain avoiding the part where it admitted it was frightened. The medical bay had a lockdown function. He could seal it. He should seal it. He started moving toward the control panel. He got as far as the door. Through the small porthole window in the bay door, he could see down the corridor, and at the far end the security door had been cut through. The cut was still glowing at the edges, and coming through it were 3 Volkai soldiers in boarding armor, moving fast, carrying disruption rifles. 2 of his alien crewmates were already down in the corridor. Not dead, he could see them moving weakly but pinned, unable to run. Ott was alone, in a corridor, with no weapon and no cover. The Volkai had not seen him yet, but they would in about 4 seconds. He did the calculation without wanting to. 4 seconds was not enough time to seal the bay door from inside. It was not enough time to reach the emergency comm panel. It was barely enough time to breathe. He pressed himself against the wall. Then something came around the corner from the opposite direction. It was wearing a medical gown. It had an IV line trailing from its left arm, long since pulled free of the access port, the end swinging loose. Its ribs were wrapped in a white brace that was visible where the gown gaped at the side. It had bare feet. It was also moving with an absolute and total sense of purpose that made the hairs on Ott's secondary skin layer stand completely upright. Sergeant Ray Decker had apparently decided that the battle station's alarm applied to him. What happened next lasted approximately 40 seconds. Ott watched all of it and later found that he could not describe it in a sensible order, because his memory of it came back in pieces rather than sequence. There was the moment Decker reached the first Volkai soldier and used the corridor wall as leverage in a way that should not have been physically possible. There was the moment the second soldier got a hit in a disruption pulse to Decker's side, and Decker staggered, absorbed it, and kept moving. There was the moment the third soldier attempted to raise a rifle and found that it had already been taken from them, and they were being directed toward the airlock with a grip that did not offer options. Then it was over. The boarding team was secured. The corridor was silent except for the distant sound of the ship's security teams finishing the fight in the other sections. Decker was leaning against the wall, not collapsed against it. Leaning. There was a difference. He was breathing hard, and there was fresh blood on the left side of his gown where the disruption pulse had torn something open, and he was going to need stitches, and he was going to need Viren to look at those ribs again because there was a very real chance he had refractured one of them. He looked at Ott. "You good?" he said. Ott opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again, still nothing. Decker nodded, as if a lack of answer was a satisfactory answer, and slid down the wall into a sitting position that was almost casual. His hand pressed against his side. He looked at the ceiling. He breathed. Viren arrived 90 seconds later at a run, medkit in hand. She stopped in the corridor doorway. She took in the secured Volkai soldiers, the two downed crewmates who were alive and beginning to sit up, the general state of the corridor, and Decker, sitting against the wall in a medical gown with bare feet, bleeding quietly. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she knelt down, opened the kit, and started working. He let her. He did not argue or wave her off or make a joke. He sat still and let her work, which felt, somehow, like the most significant thing he had done in 4 days. Commander Sale arrived 10 minutes later. The ship was fully secured by then. The boarding team was in the brig. Decker was sitting on a gurney in the medical bay, getting his side sutured, looking at the middle distance with the patient expression of a man who was ready for this day to end. Sale walked in. She looked at him for a long time. Her face was the same calm surface it always was, but her eyes were doing something different. They were doing the thing eyes do when a person is recalculating something they thought they already understood. She stopped in front of him. She stood straight, brought her right hand to her left shoulder, closed her fist, and lowered her head. The formal bow, the full version, the one Velori gave to those they considered worthy of deep and serious respect. It was not a small gesture. It was not a polite one. It was the kind that meant something in Velori culture, the kind you gave to someone who had done something you were not sure you could have done yourself. Decker blinked. He looked at Viren. She gave him a small nod that meant, "This is real and it is meant for you." He looked back at the commander. He said, "You're welcome, ma'am." Ott, from the far corner of the room, made a very small sound and looked at the ceiling. Sale straightened, turned, and walked out without another word. Viren tied off the last suture and put the instrument down and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said better. On the 5th morning, Viren cleared Sergeant Ray Decker for departure. She had run the final scans the night before and sat with the results for a long time before writing her official clearance notation. The fractured ribs had knitted in a way that suggested the bone was going to be denser at the break point than it had been before the injury. She noted this without surprise anymore. She had stopped being surprised, roughly, on day 2. What she felt now when she looked at his readings was something more like a quiet and ongoing sense of having had her understanding of the world gently, permanently rearranged. She wrote the clearance. She logged the final medical record. And then she went to the medical bay and found Decker already dressed and sitting on the edge of the examination bed, lacing up his boots with the focused attention of a man with somewhere to be. He looked up when she came in. "Am I good?" "You are cleared," she said. He nodded. He tied off the second boot. He rolled his shoulder, the left one, the one that had been dislocated, and seemed satisfied with the result. Dr. B1 arrived before Decker could stand up. He came in fast, bag open, holding a data tablet and a consent form, and the expression of a person who had spent 24 hours refining an argument and was now ready to deploy it. "I have a proposal," he said, "purely voluntary. A series of non-invasive biological observations, fully documented, fully consensual over a period of approximately 3 months. You would not need to do anything differently than you normally do. I would simply observe and take some samples and possibly some scans. And—" "No," Decker said. B1 stopped. "I have not told you what samples." "Still no. There is a stipend." Decker looked at him for a moment. "How big a stipend?" B1 named a number. Decker tilted his head. Viren watched him calculate. "Still no," he said, "but I appreciate the offer." B1 held the consent form for another second, then lowered it with the slow acceptance of a person who had expected this outcome but had still hoped. "If you change your mind," he said, "the form is on file." "I won't," Decker said pleasantly. Then Sergeant Priya came through the door, and the room's atmosphere immediately shifted in the way it always did when Priya entered a room, warmer, louder, slightly less formal. She was carrying Decker's kit bag over one shoulder and her own over the other, and she looked at B1 with the cheerful directness she used with everyone. "Are you trying to put him in a jar again?" she asked. "I was not going to put him in a jar," B1 said with some dignity. "That's what the last researcher said." She handed Decker his bag. "Transport's docked. We've got 20 minutes." Decker stood up. He picked up his bag. He looked around the medical bay, at the equipment, at the monitors, at the bed where he had slept for 4 nights. His eyes moved without hurry, the way a person's eyes move when they are quietly noting something they know they won't see again. Then he looked at Viren. She was already looking at him. She had been for the last minute from her station, in the way she had developed over 5 days, studying him from a slight distance, noting things, filing them in the part of her mind that did not have a medical category yet. He walked over. He extended his right hand, palm down, fingers loosely together. The human gesture, the one she had read about, that Priya had explained briefly during day 2, that meant any number of things depending on context but almost always meant something good. Viren looked at it. She thought about everything she had read about humans and everything she had watched, and the conversation in the dark on the second night, and what he had said about courage. She raised her own right hand. Thalori hands were 4-fingered, which made the geometry slightly different, and she took his hand and shook it. He nodded once, said nothing. That seemed right. He went to the door. Priya fell into step beside him. At the doorway, without looking back, Priya lifted one hand in a loose wave in the direction of the whole medical bay and said, "Thanks for not letting him die." "He did most of that himself," Viren said. "Yeah," Priya said, "he usually does." The door closed. Ott came to stand beside Viren. They both looked at the door for a moment. "I think," Ott said carefully, "that I need some time before the next human deployment." "You will be fine," Viren said. "I dropped my data slate. On the first day, I still have not fully processed the shoulder." "Ott." "Yes." "Go take your break. You have earned it." He nodded and left. Viren heard him walking down the corridor, and then the sound of the supply closet door opening, and then quiet. She did not say anything about it. She sat down at her station. She opened her medical log. She had one final entry to write, the official record, the one that would go into the Concord database, the one that would be read by other doctors and medical researchers, and eventually by people in offices far from any battlefield. She wrote it in full clinical language, every number, every reading, every impossible data point that she had personally recorded, dated, verified, and signed off on. She wrote it carefully because it mattered. Because someone needed to say it clearly. The Concord's medical registry for humans was wrong, had always been wrong, and needed to be updated entirely. When the clinical record was finished, she paused. The recorder was still open. Nothing said she had to add anything more. It was a medical document. Medical documents did not have personal observations. She added one anyway. Addendum, unofficial. For the record, since this document should be complete, I believe humanity is going to be just fine. I am considerably less certain about the rest of us. She closed the log. She looked out the viewport beside her station. The docking bay was on the far side of the ship, but she could see the stars from here, sharp and without movement, the way they always were. Somewhere out in the direction of the nearest Concord hub, a transport was pulling away, carrying two humans back toward their unit and their next assignment, and whatever came after that, which, Viren suspected, those two humans were entirely prepared to handle. She sat quietly for a moment. She thought about courage, the way she had been thinking about it since the second night. Not the large, dramatic version, the ordinary version. The kind that showed up in corridors with bare feet and a medical gown when the alarm went off. The kind that asked you good before it asked about itself. The kind that had been doing that quietly on a small planet in an unremarkable part of the galaxy for a very long time before anyone else in the universe was paying attention. She stood up, straightened her station, and went to find Ott. He was behind the bandage rolls, as expected. "Come on," she said. "I'll buy you something warm from the galley. We can talk about something completely unrelated to humans." He emerged looking grateful. "Can we talk about paperwork? I find paperwork very calming right now." "We can absolutely talk about paperwork." They walked down the corridor together, and the medical bay sat empty behind them, quiet and amber-lit, the monitors still on in case they were needed. Because in a ship full of living creatures, they were always needed eventually, and the last entry in Viren's log sitting in the database, waiting patiently to be read by whoever came next.